Welcome. I'm Ron Baker, Director of the Canadian Small Church Ministry Center, sponsored by Small Church Connections. And this is us, Canadian Small Churches in Action podcast. I have been looking forward to and am excited to have this opportunity to be together with, um, I was going to say a young lady. Now we'll leave it at that. with a friend of mine, and she comes from the opposite end of Canada. Well, not quite the opposite end. If she's not quite in the ocean, but down in the Toronto area, we'll call it that. And I'm going to stop trying to describe her and let her describe herself. If you can just tell us a little bit of who you are, some of your ministry background, and then we'll pop into a few questions that I think will be interesting for our listeners today.
Hi, Ron. It's so good to be
Uh,
with you today. I know we've been planning this conversation for a little while, so it's been
yeah.
nice that we were able to connect. So I'm Marilyn Draper, Dr. Marilyn Draper. I'm Associate Professor of Practical Theology at Tyndale Seminary in Toronto. And yeah, I'm not sure how much you want to know about my background. I was raised in a Christian home, and actually I was raised on a sheep farm in southwestern Ontario.
Hmm.
So I had the opportunity of seeing the Bible come alive in a lot of different ways as a child. Felt called to ministry at a very young age, but I was in a church that didn't think women should be in leadership.
Hmm.
So that left me in sort of this precarious situation. What do I do with this calling? Um, I had some strengths in teaching, loved the Bible, loved Bible study, loved prayer. And so obviously, according to my background, that meant that I was to go overseas, which over time I saw a lot of problems with that mentality. But I did. I would start to go on short-term projects overseas in different countries, but always felt called back to Canada. So ended up after my undergrad, I was in campus ministry for a while. Then I went to seminary, and it was in seminary that I actually discovered some freedom for ministry. And I think it was largely through being involved in a small church. And Ron Johnson, who's the director of Small Church Connections, was actually my supervisor when I was doing my field education in seminary. And he was really encouraging. And so my husband and I went on and explored all sorts of different ministries. Ran a small business, did quite a bit of church planting. And through that church and pastoring then that resulted from the church planting. But through that experience, some of those church plants grew and thrived and flourished, and others didn't. And so I started to have all sorts of questions about what is the Canadian context? What does it mean to plant churches here? What does it mean to pastor? Things are changing, right? By now we're into the early 2000s. And so I decided it was time to go back to school again. So I went and got my PhD. I thought it was going to be in church planting, but it ended up being, what does it actually mean to be a minister of the
Mm.
good news of the gospel? It's really more about leadership and what it means to be formed as a church planter. And then from that, I started teaching and discovered that that's actually my true calling.
Ah.
And I have really been enjoying being a seminary professor for the last several years. So that's me in a nutshell. I'm married. I have 4 adult children, um, and then just to have my fingers in a lot of different pots at the moment.
Well, that's great because maybe we can stir a few of those pots. Let's start. You've brought up enough things. I think we could go on for more than the half hour that we're supposed to. But let's just start here and see what are some of the current trends that you see relating to women in ministry. You've already talked a little bit about your own upbringing and moving into ministry. What do you see are some of the current trends that are happening?
I see a real interest for women to be involved in some kind of ministry, full-time ministry, church ministry. We now have about over 60% of our students are female
Mhm.
students now at the seminary. Um, and what I'm noticing is that women are feeling called into ministry, called into leadership, but a lot of them are hesitant. And so they're they come to seminary looking for ministries related to church, but not necessarily church. So they're looking at, how do I become a leader in a nonprofit? Or a lot of them are in our counseling program. So they
Right.
want to become therapists. our spiritual formation and becoming a spiritual director. A lot of women involved in that ministry related stream. And so they want to be in ministry, they want to follow God's calling in their lives, but they're actually looking for a career path. And they often don't see that in the church, which has been really disappointing for me. Um, so just to give an example,
Yeah,
so
yeah.
last fall I taught leadership development in person, which was a lot of fun. I've been teaching it online since the pandemic, and so to actually be back in the classroom was delightful.
Isn't
I
that fun?
had,
Yes.
yeah, I had 26 women, no, 26 students.
Mhm.
22 of those were women
Okay.
from ranging in age from 30 to 70, all looking for a second or third or fourth career. And some of them had been successful in business, some in education, some in health. So they were coming from all of these different backgrounds. And I would say that every single one of them felt some type of a calling to ministry, but a few of them felt very called to counseling. Um, but a lot of them were just unsure. And so we spent a lot of time not only talking about leadership and principles of leadership, but I had them do a variety of assessments. And not surprisingly, several of them came up very strong pastoral gifts.
Hmm.
And then we were talking about the church and what it might mean to be in the church. And for some of them, that had never even crossed their radar that that was a possibility. They'd never been encouraged in that. Of course, some of their churches had actually discouraged them from that. And so by the end of the semester, they're talking about, well, what does this actually mean? I know that one student, she's reached out to me. She's actually now applied to go into the pastoral stream. And others of them are still just sitting with it, thinking that they'll just continue to take some courses and to continue to explore what that means. But I think for me, that's the major thing that I'm hearing from women is God's calling me. The need is great. So what am I supposed to do if I'm in a situation where that's never been encouraged? How do I even begin to explore that? And what I'm noticing is that a lot of the seminaries in Canada, and Tyndale's just one of them, are sort of looking for ways to release women into ministry. At Tyndale, we've actually got one of our female professors is our preaching professor. And so she's been noticing students we've never even heard a woman preacher before. And recognizing that there's just some gaps in some of their experience, that if they can be exposed to women doing different things in the church, that can be really, really helpful. The other thing that we've decided to start is a women's hub.
Oh,
So
okay.
we have a center called the Tyndale Center for Pastoral Imagination, and it has a lot of different hubs underneath it. So I'm in the middle of creating this women's hub. It's still very much in the developmental stage, but looking specifically at how can we develop women? What might a women's ministry mentoring program look like? At this point, we've simply been gathering women together to talk about what are some of the challenges that you face, what are some of the things that have encouraged you. And the number one thing that keeps coming up again and again is they simply want to be connected to other women who are already in ministry or are exploring ministry. So at this point, we've been creating some opportunities for some of that relationship building to happen.
In in the past few years, I've taught a course on philosophy and practice of ministry at a Pentecostal school, and in that school, the freedom to be a minister was very open, I guess we'll call it. Having come from a denomination that has had to work through some of that, I do realize where you're also talking about. Uh, the Some of the women in the class that I taught wanted to write a book about women in ministry and the attitudes that come in order to be effective, particularly in their context. Um, Interesting, some of the people that we interviewed, the immediate uh, attitude was you've got to be humble in order to move forward. Whereas they liked the title for their book, calling it I Am Not an Elephant's Toothpick, which was the idea that, you can tell me all sorts of things to do, but I'm here to minister. I'm not here to be your coffee bearer.
Mhm.
So where have you found the best approaches for women in ministry to effectively move into? I mean, there's various contexts and various different places, but
Mhm.
I'll leave that and let you run with that a bit.
One of my concerns has actually been that all the women want to be therapists. Uh,
Okay.
some of them are definitely called to become psychotherapists, and those ones I want to release into
Mhm.
that. But others, I think, are actually very strong theologically, and I don't want our congregations to become too psychologically oriented, if that makes sense, right? I
Right.
want them to develop that theological piece. And so I have found simply sitting down and talking with some of the women and just encouraging them to even consider what would it be involved to be in pastoral work. One of the courses that I ended up developing is called Women and Men in Ministry Partners in Church Leadership,
Mm.
because I realized what it required for some of those women was actually getting into the passages. So we already have a course called Women in the Old Testament that they can take with one of our Old Testament professors. So that sets them up in terms of the Old Testament. And then when they come into the course with me, we look at things like context, the Canadian context specifically.
Hmm.
And then we dig into some of those New Testament passages and actually unpack some of their own experiences. Where have they come from and why and what's holding them back? Some of them want to make changes in their own congregations, and so I want to release them to do that. Others, like myself, I actually ended up needing to go to a different denomination. When I decided that I wanted to look at ordination, then I needed to find a denomination that would ordain me. My husband and I decided we wanted to be ordained together.
Mm.
And so we specifically looked for an ordination to be ordained in a denomination that would do that. And we were ordained in the same ceremony, um, which was a lot of fun.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because for women who are married, there's often that sense of we want to actually be involved in some kind of a family or a couples ministry. For other women who are single or who have gifts that are different than their partner, to be able to be in a denomination or in a setting where they are free to then go on and use and develop those gifts.
Mhm.
Um, and what I'm seeing, well, one of the things that I'm seeing is we are now actually having female, right, presidents of schools. So
Yes.
Tyndale has a female
Some
president.
of my friends
Acadia
are.
has a female president. We are seeing women take on a lot more of a variety of professorships. And I think simply seeing women in the church in leadership, right? Women in denominational roles. So I think it's happening. The other thing, of course, that's happening is at the same time, we're also getting this traditional role emphasis reestablished. And so for younger women, there's a lot of opportunity for discussion.
Oh,
What did that?
there can definitely be tension there. There's no question about it. Okay, let's jump to some of what you've already been implying or talking about, and that's mentorship. Can you give some thoughts on that? And that's not just for women, but for men, for all of us who are in ministry, our pastors, and I think particularly young pastors. Let just walk away with that whole area.
One of the things we talk about in the leadership class specifically is getting away from this idea of the self-sufficient leader.
Mm.
So to recognize that we're not lone rangers. And so I think a lot of mentorship is simply recognizing we can't do this alone. We shouldn't do this alone. God isn't asking us to do this alone. So what areas do we really need help? And sometimes, and our school system has sort of trained us, then that means, well, any area of your where you're weak, that's where you need to be. Find someone. And sometimes that's helpful, but I often find with a young pastor particularly, is actually focus on your strength first. How has God equipped you? What's your area of strength and passion? And find someone who does that really well and work on that first. So connect with that person to develop that strength. And then over time, um, there'll be areas of weakness that emerge, but often I encourage them, those areas of weakness, give those things away. Find someone with an area of strength to actually do that so that you don't have to spend all your time in your weakness. And if you're developing that strength muscle, then that gives you even more room to work in your strengths, to hopefully then release other people to work in your areas of weakness. And often what I find, what I tell people is don't look for just one person, but look for a variety of people. And to sometimes look for the unexpected, right? If there's an area of prayer where you're feeling called to develop, it could be a widow who's already in your congregation. Spend time with her, pray with her, listen to her pray. If there's someone that you know that has been a minister for years and years of faithfulness, simply talk to them, develop that relationship. What's enabled them to minister for 20, 30, 40, 50 years? What's kept them going? Why are they resilient? And the other thing that I find in mentorship is sometimes we focus very much on the skills, which can be really, really helpful. But sometimes it's those things underlying the skills. Um, what has this person learned about God? Um, what, how has God shown up in their context? I am doing more and more work. Another course that I teach is evangelism and discipleship. And I'm doing more and more work on story and the importance of narrative and the sharing of stories and the value of stories and how important and the story that we tell ourselves about ourselves is so key. And I think the story that we tell ourselves about God is key. And I think that what I'm discovering with mentorship is a lot of simply building relationships so that we're sharing our stories with one another. And then we're picking things out from one another's stories of, oh, that was an interesting um, approach that that person take, but we also recognize they took that approach because of their context. So then it allows us to step back, and we don't have to just repeat what they did, but to say, okay, what are the principles that we're reflecting upon? And so it might look different in my context, but we still recognize that, oh, I got it from them. It's because I spent time with them learning their story that I'm equipped in this way, but it's going to look very different because my context, my time, my setting, my personality is different than theirs.
So how do us older people then? What should we be looking for? How should we be approaching mentorship or being mentors?
What? That's a really good question. Um,
Yeah, it comes from the gray hair, by the way. Yeah, that.
I think it's noticing.
Mhm.
I think often we don't we will see something in somebody else, but I think we're often hesitant to take the initiative to say to someone. And I would love to see our older people looking at someone and saying, I've seen this in you.
Mhm.
Has anyone ever mentioned that to you before? And simply have a conversation about that. Uh, there's one congregation I've been helping out a little bit, and one of the elders came to me one day, and she just said, "Okay, I've been noticing in our pastor, right, this, and this. What do you think might help him, or how could I help him?" And I thought that's a wonderful attitude to have. She's not sitting in judgment. She just says, I know that these are some areas where I see some real strengths in him that I'd love to see him grow. And there's a couple areas of weaknesses that I really wonder how as an elders group can we support him in that. Um, one of the ways that I think the older generation could help the younger is simply through asking better questions.
Oh, okay.
Um, so that we're asking questions about where is God in this situation? What is God like? It's a question that to me, this is such a simple question, but it's a question that I come back to time and time again as I'm meeting with students or I'm meeting with pastors. And I'm saying, where did you see God show up in that situation? And because of that, what is God's character like? Because I feel like we're getting so caught up in problems and solutions that just bringing us back to that level of theological reflection is so important. And that is an easy question that anybody can learn. And it means that in a mentor, sometimes we think that mentorship has to be very, very detailed and directive. I have to set up a schedule and determine these are the things that I can pass on. And I've come to the conclusion Largely through the internship course. And I could actually just tell you a little bit about how our internship course is set
Yes,
up, if that
please,
would be of
please.
interest to you. Okay,
Yeah,
so
yeah.
how we set up our internship is it's based on the student creating a learning covenant. And the student picks up 3 to 5 things, ministry skills, or something that they want to develop. And then they go to their internship placement and their supervisor, and they work through, can these 3 to 5 things actually be explored and developed during the time that they're there? Usually a 2 semester block, so usually an 8 month block. And one of the commitments that placement makes to them is that the supervisor will meet with them for 1 hour a week. But the students are responsible largely for setting up the agenda of what they talk about with the supervisor. And we want them to talk about those specific skills and those skill development. But a lot of that we talk about is make it general and learn the story. Learn the story of the placement, learn the story of your supervisor, and then build on that relationship to develop those skills.
So okay, let me interrupt, but I'll let you continue on. But so what I'm hearing is instead of the supervisor necessarily having to pull out all the books with all of the right principles and all of the right, basically tell story and explain what's happened. And would that be, which is a little different than some internships early on that I would have experienced, which were really, here's the pastoral methods course manual, just learn it and memorize it.
Yeah. So something like a skill a student might want is a funeral. So
Hmm.
there's obviously going to be some very particular practical skills. Like I remember the first time I did a funeral, actually sitting down with someone who'd done a lot of funerals was just so helpful. It
Yeah.
relieved, but what it did was that it relieved my anxiety about what was supposed to happen. So then we could talk about underlying, right? What does death actually mean and what might the family be experiencing as a loss? The same with the wedding. The first time I had to do a wedding, meeting with an older pastor to actually go through a wedding ceremony and what happens, that helps relieve the stress of the actual doing of the task and the skill. But then you can spend time hearing from the pastor of, the times that they did weddings that it didn't go well and
Yeah.
expectations weren't met. And so that also equips the student to deal with the unexpected and to deal with questions like, okay, yeah, so how do I recognize expectations?
Hmm.
And so what we find is that the skill is important, but the stories that then emerge help the student to go much deeper and they begin to ask different questions. So they're asking things like, oh, so in that case, it was actually a boundary issue that was a problem or an expectation issue. Well,
Hmm.
how do I recognize that those things are happening? How did you do it? Um how might I respond differently? And then to have opportunities to reflect upon that. So the textbook for the students in the classroom part of the internship, they're in small groups. 4 of the students meet with a professor. And for the textbook is the case studies that the students write. So the students write just a 6 page assessment of something that surprised them, something that shocked them, something that disappointed them, something that went completely off the rails. And they write the narrative. They can't do any defensiveness. They simply write the narrative. This is what happened. Then they do some analysis, and this is why I think what happened. And then they do some theological reflection, and then they do some assessment in terms of, the future or whatever. And so they write this up, they present it to their small group, and the small group receives this a few days in advance, prays over it, prays for the student, and prays that the Lord will bring forth questions. So then when they gather together, the other students cannot give advice. They can't tell the student what to do. They can't problem solve and tell the student how to fix it. They bring their questions. And those questions are to help the students reflect. And sometimes another student has brought forward a question, and whether it's on Zoom or in person, I can just see myself and the other students, like our mouths just drop open, like that is the question needed to unpack this.
That sounds like what a good local ministerial should be doing
Hmm.
as with the ministers in town or the ministers in an area. I think, okay, I'm going to jump into a whole other area here.
Sure.
Your small churches in
Mhm.
context. You're kind of thinking a bit about that at the school and that you're in right now. Give us some thoughts on what your thinking is about small churches. That's a big, broad question. Just go for it.
It is. There are a lot of differences between small churches in rural,
Oh boy.
Ontario, right? Rural Ontario is very different from urban
Hmm.
Ontario. Uh, so having lived in both rural contexts and in the urban context, yeah. Um, Congregations vary a lot, first gen immigrants to second gen
Oh,
immigrants.
very, yeah.
Um, Congregations are varying a lot from which combinations of languages. Right now, the real interest and the area that we're seeing tremendous turning to the gospel is in the Persian community.
Oh, okay.
And so, but I would say I've probably talked with three different congregations who are handling Persians coming into their group completely differently. So I think what I'm seeing in terms of small congregations is freedom to recognize our context is unique, and we don't have to look over there and take their program and adopt it. And that is very freeing. So I was a church planter in the early 2000s, and it was very much you run off to an American sort of conference
Hmm.
and you kind of take what you can and you bring it back and you put that into the Canadian context. And so even when I started teaching, I noticed the students were still doing that. And I would say, remember, the Canadian context is different. So if you go to something in the States and they tell you you'll do this event and 200 people will come, I say just take off a zero. If you do
Hmm.
this event, you may get 20 people and consider that a success. So I think there's been a recognition that we can't be doing that. We can't run off to different parts of Canada. We can't run off to the States because our context is unique. And I think that that's freeing and helpful, but also terrifying
Hmm.
for a lot of pastors because then I do feel like they're still sort of grappling, what book can I read? There's got to be a silver bullet somewhere. And so what I'm noticing in terms of small churches is asking the question, what does it mean to be successful?
Hmm.
Um, and can we actually rethink that idea of success? So the number one thing that I talk to pastors about of small churches, whether they're whatever they said, is to say, start to just verbalize that. And are you seeing success as growth? And if you're saying success as growth, can we just take that off the table and say that's not the whole be all and end all? It's not about growth, it's not about control, but what is it? And so that's where sort of the conversations are going. So one of the groups that I'm working with are a group of second gen Korean students who are specifically in a course called Reframing the Church in Context. And so as we're exploring some of these issues, they're recognizing, yes, we're very much shaped by the Canadian context. And so there are things that we want to do and explore. But the number of times that their eyes have been open to say, but we are still very much shaped by our Korean.
Yeah.
We don't want to let go of that because there is so much value in that as well. So how do we bring those two together to be a Canadian Korean church in this particular part of Toronto? Um, and it has been fun to explore. And the other thing, it's taken us longer
Oh, it would.
than we expected. So there was one course that I did with them in the summer of 2023 or 24. Anyway, a while ago now, 2023.
Hmm.
And just I met with them in January and just feeling they're still unpacking some of the things that we introduced back then. And so that's the other thing I've been noticing is why do we have to do this quickly? Can we slow down in our process? Because if we're really going to emphasize storytelling and relationships, that takes time.
Yeah.
And so not to rush on ahead.
Okay. This has been great. It tells me that we should do another podcast because our time's up. Uh, but I do have one question that I ask each person that I do a podcast with, and that is, if you had one piece of advice, doesn't matter what it is on what we've talked about, maybe not on what we've talked about today, one piece of advice for a small church pastor, a small church leader, what would that be?
I will repeat something I've already said, actually.
Okay.
Don't focus on growth.
Hmm.
Growth is not the be all and end all. Don't spend your time worrying about it. Don't spend your time saying that this will be my mark of success, but instead focus on the people who God's given you in this place right now. Pray for them, look for their gifts, look for their strengths, talk to them about their passions, and learn to talk about how is God showing up in their lives. Really get to know their stories and unpack your bags so that you can share your story with them.
Yeah.
Don't see this as a stepping stone to something bigger, something greater,
Mhm.
but actually say, I'm here, and while I'm here, I am fully present here. And so I will meet with the people, I'll spend time with the people, I'll pray for the people, and we will look for how God is at work in our context, and we'll see what happens.
Excellent advice. Excellent advice. Well, thank you very much, Marilyn. Sorry, we've got to quit, but it's been very good. So thank you very much.
So good to talk to you today, Ron, and I look forward to another conversation.
All right.